Welcome everyone. My name's Will Marion. I'm the co-founder of the Positive Group. It's great to have so many of you turn up for the first webinar of the year. We've had so many people turn up who followed our series back last year, and we've also got a whole load of new faces. So welcome everyone, and thank you for following us and joining today. I know your time is precious. I'm joined by two of my colleagues who are brilliant psychologists. I have Dr. Alice G, who's a clinical psychologist and leads lots of our programs. Good afternoon, Alice.
Hi there.
And I'm also joined by the co-founder of Positive. He's a health psychologist and a medic, Dr. Brian Marion.
Hi, everybody.
So, Alice, Brian, the subject we are taking on today is that of mindset, and in particular, the role that optimism and pessimism play as we sort of look into what is a pretty uncertain future. And I just to make everyone aware, mindset is a really big interest of Positives. It's actually one pillar of our four pillars, if you like. So we have awareness, focus, mindset, and connection. So we've been looking at this with our clients across the corporate and educational space for some time. So we should be quite well versed in this space. I think it's something that's so relevant right now to the challenge of COVID, because this is something that's just constantly challenged our beliefs and assumptions about the future. We've been thinking that things are coming back to normal. We thought we were heading off to a relatively normal Christmas. We're now in a pretty severe lockdown. So we keep getting sort of knocked back by the pandemic, and this sort of return to some form of normality keeps getting pushed back. So I think it's a really topical subject for right now. Alice, let's get into it. I'd love to just tee this up with a definition, or a psychological definition, if you like, of mindset. What do we mean when we say mindset?
Yeah, so when we look at mindset, what we're talking about is a core set of beliefs and assumptions that shape our expectations, that shape how we perceive the world and how we respond to events. So it's like a lens through which you see events that actually shapes your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviors, your opinions, your beliefs about everything. And it really helps then to determine how we cope. It's about, here's a situation, and it's the lens through which you perceive that, and it drives then how you respond. And really then mindsets can be really helpful to us. They can help us to stay motivated and to thrive even in the face of difficulty, or they can also really hinder us. They can really trap us in cycles of thinking that are not that helpful to us. So it's really important to become aware of our own mindsets, to start to tune in to our own thoughts, feelings, behaviors, beliefs, etc., to see what are our mindsets about lots of different things. And here it might be about the future, thinking about going forward. And we can break down mindset into state and traits. So mindsets can be rooted in mood. So mood states can influence our mindsets, right? So our moods are quite transient, they change all the time, and that can shift our mindset. But also there's sort of, you alluded to optimism and pessimism, and that's so important. Yeah. That's more of a sort of trait aspect. It's more enduring, more persistent. And that sort of is about, the general beliefs you have about yourself and the world, the future, other people. Yeah. And that's sort of more ingrained. But the point is, no matter what, your moods are transient, but also your optimism and pessimism can also change. That's not immutable. We can change our mindsets.
But I'm really interested, because I mean, there's so much written and said about the benefits of optimism. Can you share a bit more on the benefits of optimism?
Yeah, so optimism is about expecting good things to happen, right, in life. It's expecting that things will turn out well, and actually even if there are hurdles and difficulties, you kind of find the silver lining. So there's this drive to see the good, and I think that has real benefits. Psychologically speaking, optimistic people tend to be less tend to have less depression, less anxiety. They experience sort of things are less stressful, really. And they tend to enjoy life more. They have greater life satisfaction. There are health benefits. So you're going to have better immune function. You're going to have less inflammation in your body. You tend to live longer. So optimists tend to live longer and enjoy that journey more. And then there are benefits in certain outcomes. So for example, job, sporting outcomes, education outcomes, creativity, lots of different areas in which people kind of do better if they are optimistic. So there's quite a lot in there to consider.
I mean, it sounds fantastic, doesn't it? Sign me up. I mean, I think one of the things that we need to be very wary of is there's a dark side to optimism, isn't there, or a more difficult side, and also there's also benefits to pessimism as well. So Brian, just I know this is a big interest of yours. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, I think optimism, as Alice has mentioned, has huge benefits because it sort of gives you this sort of rose-tinted view of the future. And I think just to frame this, I think human beings have this extraordinary capacity to time travel and run the video on fast forward. So optimists tend to run a video which is slightly rose-tinted, everything will be fine. Whereas the pessimist sees the flaws and the problems and the pit holes and the holes in the ground. I think just looking at the downside of optimism, I think there is the sort of Pollyanna type process, and particularly sometimes what's called deluded optimism. There is a danger that we use optimism to make ourselves feel better. So we run the video on fast forward and think everything will be fine. And what's been shown is that there is a danger with too much optimism, or that form of optimism that isn't linked to behaviors and action. So if you're very optimistic, you may be a smoker, but you don't think you'll get lung cancer, you don't think you'll get heart disease, and that actually encourages behaviors that are actually pretty bad for us. And I think we're seeing this with COVID. Some people who have a deluded optimism think they won't catch it, they won't get ill if they do catch it, and they won't infect other people. This is really spooky stuff. So I think there's a sense in which too much optimism can be a negative. I think what we need, as you mentioned, is a combination. We need what's called strategic optimism. So running the video on fast forward, seeing how you can deal with things, but also a little defensive pessimism. And the defensive pessimism is often called safety netting or contingency planning. So if that happened, if it goes wrong, then we'll do this. And it links to solutions. So you think, well, if that happened, we could do this. So that contingency planning means that if something, and you see this in entrepreneurs often have this wonderful view of what's going to happen to their business. I think a little defensive pessimism can be valuable, just to warn one of what may happen. And I think just on that concept, I think if you can actually run the video on fast forward and see yourself coping with setbacks, this is an amazingly powerful cognitive tool. People who can see themselves coping with difficulties, problems, and setbacks, it dampens down their threat circuit because they move the threat into a challenge. And I know that sounds like a cliche, but they actually see themselves coping. So I think there's another form of optimism that is probably slightly more nuanced, which is hope. And there's been a lot of work done on hope. Hope and optimism on their own are pretty ineffectual, but hope combined to strategy, what are you going to do? What's the pathway? How are you going to get there? And chunking it up. Linked to agency. And the agency bit is, I can see myself doing this. I can see myself getting through this. I can see myself achieving this. So it combines pathway with agency. And this is the Henry Ford line, if you think you can, or you think you can't, you're probably right. And the stories we tell ourselves, and I think this is really key, the stories we tell ourselves have an enormous impact on how we think, feel, and behave, and how we feel. They change our neurochemistry, they change our neural circuits, they change our physiology, they change how we behave. So just linking this briefly to the COVID crisis and tolerance of uncertainty, we're seeing massive change in uncertainty, which makes lots of us anxious. But what's interesting is that leadership that has a high tolerance of uncertainty, and there's a very good meta-analysis looking at this. Leadership that has a high tolerance of uncertainty enjoy greater business success. So companies that have leaders who can actually talk about how we're going to get through this and message that to their teams, that is a fantastically protective process.
No, I think that's fascinating, isn't it? So that realistic, strategic optimism, where actually you are thinking, well, actually, if this did happen, here's how we would respond, here's how we would get out of it. And that sort of links into that concept of anticipation, doesn't it? We actually are more scared of the anticipation of something bad happening than the actual event itself. So if you can have that sort of thought process that, if this happened, you can actually think about it happening and then moving on from it and thinking about re-strategizing and being flexible in that is key to that. And thank you. And I think that difference between hope and optimism is a really important one right now. Alice, I think we touched on this a little bit at the beginning, but we've been in the pandemic for quite some time now. We're coming up for a year. It's hugely uncertain, and one of the things that I think we're all acutely aware of is that the amount of noise around the pandemic is just huge, and we're all experiencing it in slightly different circumstances. And one of the things I'm really interested in is, how does the environment that we're in and that noise affect our mindset?
Yeah, I think as you say, it is so noisy. There's just such a lot of different messaging. Brian talked about the stories we tell ourselves. There's also the stories we're hearing all around us all the time. And we have to be aware of our news consumption. I think, what we know this year, well now, there's a sense of fatigue, isn't there? There's disillusionment, with everything that's going on. And what we've seen very clearly is an uptick in people's mental health difficulties, mood issues around anxiety and depression sort of tripling over the course of the last year. Health anxiety 3 times up as well. There's some genuine difficulties people are experiencing, and I think a lot of it is to do with, we are quite we have a negativity bias. We are very drawn to what's negative. That's about a survival instinct. We have to be aware of the dangers around us. But actually, those negative events, those negative messages also have huge potency for us, and they can really affect us. And if then we are constantly being primed by the messaging that's out there in society, in the news all the time, these quite terrifying messages that people are receiving, that has a real impact. It means, that we are having that threat state activated all the time. Brian just mentioned this, that we're constantly on alert, and that shifts your mood. It changes how you think, how you feel, how you behave. You can get locked into very negative thinking around things, and then and it's very sticky. You can get really stuck in that, and it can be hard to move into a sort of more helpful way of thinking. So we do have to be cautious about it.
And it's quite subconscious as well, isn't it, a lot of the time?
Well, that's it. It's so much of this priming that goes on is not within your consciousness. It's just all around you, just picking it up, and actually trying to bring this more to consciousness by becoming much more aware of your own thoughts and of your own feelings, and how that's fitting and how you're physiologically how you're responding to that. That becomes very important to try and make any change. You can't change what you don't know, so the awareness is absolutely at the root of this. I also want to say, for some people through this period, that they've actually had more positive experiences. So for example, with social connection, some people feel that that's been so taken away from them this year, and the nurturing relationships we have that allow us to feel more neurologically safe and to allow us to have the mindset that we would choose at that point, that can be really lacking. But for others, they might find that they've had this year a stronger sense of community, for example. They've really built deeper relationships with children, with family members, whoever's been close. And I think so different people have had slightly different experiences with this. And what we're talking about here is moving really from that threat state that's around to really nurturing safety states, that actually we can regulate emotion better and regulate our attention better, and therefore kind of choose our mindset better.
Any thoughts on that, Brian? I know you're interested in the concept of cyberchondria.
Well, I think as social animals, we're tuned very powerfully to listen to each other and hear about what's happening. And what we're told, we tend to believe, whether it's true or whether it's false. And I think you're seeing this around immunization, but I think that one of the problems with lots of negativity, and I think if you watch our media, there's a huge swing to the negative, and I think we hear very little about the positive stories and how people are coping and managing, and the extraordinary resilience and strength that people demonstrate in their day-to-day lives, whether they're NHS workers or teachers or parents. And I think there's a danger that we focus on disaster. Now, there is a real and present danger. There is a real problem. But human beings have dealt with all sorts of problems over millennia. And I think we need to actually tap into our strengths and our qualities and look to support each other. And I think there's a danger that the doom mongers on the media who sort of outvie each other for more negative data is not the way to cheer people up. So I think actually it's that wonderful old Paul Simon thing, isn't it? I get all the news I need on the weather report. I think you have to be careful about how much news you watch.
No, absolutely. I can completely agree with that. And I think also the pandemic has also, if you think about mindset, it's changed our collective mindset around so many things, isn't it? So that's the sort of all of the the change, it can create so much progress around this. If you think about the way that we all will be able to work when we come back to some form of reality. Well, in many senses, the world has moved forward, leaps and bounds and years. And I know Positives really found that in terms of the attitude towards psychological health, the attitude towards learning. So much of this has actually really propelled us forward.
Just jumping in on Alice's mention about health anxiety, I think what was really interesting is that health anxiety, we all have some degree of health anxiety. When we get a symptom, we wonder what it is. But now we may start thinking when we're tired or feeling a bit hot or a bit sweaty or a bit breathless, or we get a cough, that we have a serious illness and we're going to get ill and end up on a ventilator. The interesting aspect to this is that as soon as you start having those thoughts, and it's coming back to thoughts, it's coming back to mindset, as soon as you start having those spooky thoughts, that makes you more anxious. But when you get more anxious, you have more spooky thoughts. And this is called cognitive emotional fusion, and it links to rumination. And that is a factor that can take us down a very dark path, and it can make us feel really wound out and exhausted. So I think we should be helping people understand these mechanisms, because once you understand these mechanisms, you can start to look at some very effective strategies to mitigate them.
No, absolutely. Brian, I just want to, or both of you, I just want to swing our attention to the role of leadership, because this is something that we've been looking a lot at within organizations. I think it's also pretty obvious the impact of leadership on a global scale as well. And there's been a fair amount of incidents on that front all over the world recently. So I think the challenge that faces us all individually around mindset, optimism, pessimism is huge. But the challenge that faces leaders who have to create the right narrative for large groups of people, for whole organizations often, is even greater. And also all of our research has shown that the impact that leaders have is disproportionate to anyone else. So, and it's almost certainly the most controllable variable that organizations have to influence psychological health, performance, engagement, trust, whatever it is you're looking at. So I'd love to just dig into the role of leadership around this. And one of the things I know we've written about a bit recently, has been written about quite a lot, is the Stockdale Paradox, because I think this neatly sums up the challenge facing leadership at the moment. So for those of you who don't know, James Stockdale, he's a US Navy Vice Admiral, and he was captured in Vietnam when he was a captain. And his challenge, as a leader, he saw his challenge was to communicate to his fellow prisoners, this sense of hope in an incredibly difficult and uncertain situation. And later, he said that those who felt they would be home by Christmas, what he called the optimists, fared much worse mentally than those who understood it might take much longer and therefore were able to adjust. And I think we're we're right in this situation on the pandemic, aren't we? Where, it's a real marathon now, and this balance of hope and optimism. And within the Stockdale thing, many of his fellow prisoners later credited his message around optimism, tempered by realism, with helping them to survive. And Brian, I think this is such a key thing for organizations and leaders to consider. How do you achieve that?
I think this is key. I think this is, and I think again, it's the stories we tell ourselves, but the messages we send other people, and we're very sensitive to those messages. And we're tribal animals. We listen to each other. So I think what Stockdale highlights for me is that he had two things. He had this brutal acceptance of the facts, and this links to a big area that's researched very powerfully now in psychology called acceptance and commitment. So acceptance is accepting things being as they are. And a lot of distress in human beings is non-acceptance, is wanting things to be different to how they are. Now, wanting things to be different to how they are is actually pretty much a waste of time, because it's exhausting, because they are as they are. It is as it is. So I think what Stockdale did was take what has now been demonstrated with some very robust randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses. This works. This actually works. So a brutal acceptance that things are as they are. Now, we can't influence the RNA of a virus and whether it mutates or not. But what you can do is accept that there is a very unpleasant and devastating pandemic. And how do we deal with it? His second process was that he had this cognitive process in his head, which is, I can prevail. I can get through this. And not that it's going to end at Christmas or end at Easter. Because as soon as you do that, the optimists died early, because when they got to Christmas, they weren't freed. And Viktor Frankl saw exactly the same outcomes in Auschwitz, that actually thinking you were going to be out by a certain time made you devastated when it didn't come true. So optimism, again, is seen to have this downside. I think what Stockdale thought about is, actually, I can deal with this. If it goes on and on, I can deal with it. I can cope with this. And I think what that does is it converts the threat to challenge, and it takes you out of the anticipatory threat, which is the thing that keeps people in this cognitive emotional loop that can actually cause rumination, worry, chronic stress, pushing up cortisol, impacting physical health and mental health. And just on the pessimism side, pessimism is associated, this negative thinking is associated with mental health problems because of worry, rumination, also associated with depression, also associated with poorer health outcomes, as Alice has mentioned. So this isn't just a fluffy, woolly, nice to have thing. This is absolutely fundamental to our quality of life, how much we enjoy the journey, and how long we manage to hang around. And just to finish, it actually improves your immune function. And that's pretty important at the moment.
Yeah. And I think on the leadership front, it's this, it links into the social contagion of it, doesn't it? I mean, you don't actually have a choice around this. You cannot not communicate, and the messages put out there by, particularly by leaders, are taken and interpreted, in a stronger way than anyone else. So, I think just the power, around this, and the importance in actually, what we look at with leaders is actually that healthy self-interest, walking the walk, and actually applying the cognitive and behavioral and psychological skills that can actually enable you to support yourself and others, and choose those paths around cognition, behavior, etc. So I just aware of time, we're holding ourselves to half an hour on an absolutely huge subject, so I'm going to keep us motoring on. Alice, just to come to you, one of the things that Positive look at is developing capability and psychological skills for what we call psychological skills for the future. We mentioned that mindset is a pillar of the Positive, the Positive program. It would be great. I know we can't delve into these skills and the tools that build this, but it'd be great for you just to highlight a couple that are really relevant to creating a protective mindset.
Yeah, and I think there's two or three key ones really. And I mentioned earlier, the capacity to become aware, self-aware, aware of your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviors, aware of what underlies that in terms of your mindset. That's a really fundamental point, that emotional awareness, self-awareness, because that's at the root of emotional literacy. And if you have a vocabulary around your own feelings and thoughts and so on, if you have the capacity to reflect on those, to think about them and to evaluate them a little bit, then that gives you the capacity to regulate emotion. So when everything's really uncertain and difficult, there are endless challenges and it all feels so hard, and emotions might get sort of quite high with that. It's about being able to notice that and do something about it. So emotional awareness and then regulation. And these are not simple skills. I mean, these are things that take time to practice and build. It takes a real commitment to do that. And, but it begins with that point of reflecting, understanding, and then doing something about that over time as those habits really get ingrained and become second nature. Yeah. And the second thing, so one aspect is emotional awareness. The second is attentional awareness as well. It's thinking about what is hijacking your attention? What are you focusing on at the moment? Is it on all the terrible news and that's all you're looking at? Are you just absorbing a lot of this negative stuff? And what impact is that having? Is that helpful to you or not? So starting to reflect on where's our attention? What are you thinking about? What's absorbing all of that? And can you do something about that? Which actually brings us on to a sort of third aspect of that, which is cognitive flexibility. And that's the capacity to realize, what you're thinking, to evaluate that, to think, is that helpful to me or not? Can I be open to new ideas? Can I shift the way I'm thinking in order for this to be more helpful to me? Which means then that you can change your mindset. If you have those skills, you've got the stepping stones to really shifting your mindset to something that's going to be more helpful for you. And as a leader, that's incredibly important. But just as individuals in our own lives, it's incredibly important. So that, I think, very briefly would be what I would say are some of the key kind of learning points, really key skills that we can develop over time with commitment, with a real sense of understanding of the background of it in order to help ourselves really.
That's really helpful, and I know those skills are things we've been supporting organizations with, and having to do that in the added difficulty for most people of working virtually. So a lot of this, is conveyed, through social interaction. A lot of it is sort of just, passed through that, how sticky, emotion and engagement can be within organizations. So I think there are those, obviously, those real challenges of how you do that in a virtual world, which is also fascinating. One of the things, just quickly, if anyone watching wants to know more around the programs we run and the skills we can develop for leaders, teams, individuals, whether it's you individually looking to come onto something and work with Positive, or for part of your organization, please do get in touch with us, info@positivegroup.org. We'd love to discuss this further with you. So Brian, Brian and Alice, just to sum up, it'd be great to just try and really sort of bottle this down. What I'm hearing is that mindset is really does matter. It's also flexible. It can be influenced by a lot of what the psychological skills you've just mentioned, Alice, and it can be influenced in you, but it can also be influenced massively in others. Particularly when you look at leadership and hierarchies within teams. This concept of adaptive hope, which Brian's touched on around, and I know we love that concept, around the Stockdale Paradox, and it's fundamental to retain that faith, that hope that we will prevail in the end, but that acceptance and commitment and that ability to confront the brutal realities of it. And I think there's a real key here that we cannot not communicate, particularly as leaders. So we are messaging all of the time, and I think that is around the levels of hope, around the levels of optimism, which links directly into our health and performance. And I think from what I'm hearing, if I was to sum this up, the leaders and teams that have good psychological skills, they'll be healthier for themselves. They have that healthy self-interest. They'll perform better, particularly in uncertainty and times of pressure, and they'll be much better at supporting those around them and those that they work with, those in their teams, many of whom are going to be facing some real challenges over the months ahead. Any final comments for our audience on that?
I'd like to just raise the spectre, the hope. I think this is to be hopeful at the end here. There's room for optimism, because I think when I went through med school and trained as a doctor, we thought mindsets were personality traits that never changed. We now know about neuroplasticity. You can change your mind. I think your cognitive style, whether you're a pessimist or an optimist, we get into patterns, we get into habits, they become a default. I think what's clear is the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we tell each other really matter. And I think it's just summed up by Viktor Frankl, who wrote a wonderful book called Man's Search for Meaning when he was in Auschwitz, or when he came out of Auschwitz. And he has this lovely line where he says, between the stimulus and the response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. And I think what's so wonderful about that is it links to what you were saying, Will, that I think how we feel inside, we tend to push into the world. What we push into the world impacts on other people. The stories we tell each other and the stories we tell each other is so powerful in terms of enjoying our journey. And I think we need to pay far more attention to that process.
Absolutely. Well, look, I just want to say a huge thank you, Brian and Alice. I've really enjoyed this conversation. It's a fascinating topic. I know we could talk about it all day. Also, a huge thank you to everyone who's attended today. It was brilliant to have you with us. We're going to be running a whole series throughout the year, so do stay tuned, and hopefully you'll come along and see some other webinars that we run. And do get in touch if you'd like to talk to us. But many thanks. Have a lovely afternoon, and see you all soon.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.